I normally don't do videos on so-called celebrities and or what is trending in the media for many reasons. But this topic, which has resurfaced from some years ago, has compelled me to offer a potentially more nuanced perspective than the media has given us, in which I personally believe is done intentionally. A few years back, the artist Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, made a statement on TMZ that to be enslaved for 400 years sounds like a choice.
When you hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice.
Now, obviously, it's safe to say that the artist turned fashion mogul was talking about the people of African descent who were enslaved throughout the Americas. There are some things wrong with what Ye said and continues to say in the public, and we should challenge those things. But silencing someone or dismissing them as crazy is not the solution to the problem. When someone says something that I may initially disagree with, I try to come from a place of understanding rather than discord. Let's break down what Ye said and why what he said was so hurtful to some, but also why we should not throw everything he said away. First, Ye mentions that people were enslaved for 400 years, and if one is enslaved for 400 years, then it must be a choice. For one, obviously, no individual lives for 400 years, so there is no individual choice in Ye's assessment. Ye seems to be talking about a collective generational choice by people. Well, people across multiple generations cannot make a collective choice in unison, so that right there is a very generalizing statement and should obviously not be taken as a serious historical fact. Another aspect about Ye's statement is that he mentions the number 400 years, which means he is most likely talking about the transatlantic slave trade to the overall Americas, North, South, and the Caribbean included, and not just talking about the United States and the colonies that would later become the United States, since that legal slavery persisted only 246 years between 1619 and 1865. When one considers the legal slavery of Africans being practiced in Latin America and the Caribbean that extends from around 1500 to 1888 with the abolition of slavery in Brazil, then you're talking about close to 400 years. Now, the reason why these statements can be interpreted by many as being offensive is due to the obvious reason that throughout U.S. history, the slave-holding class has often justified the institution explaining that Africans were docile and childlike by nature and accepted their servile position in captivity. They would also justify the enslavement of African people explaining that slavery was also a civilizing mission, introducing blacks to Christianity and decent virtues. Therefore, blacks were very thankful for their conversion and introduction to the white man and his ways. So saying blacks chose slavery sounds like it echoes the sentiments of those slaveholders of the past, as well as the Southern so-called white historians who justified slavery in the following decades. However, a clear common response to the claims back then that so-called black people chose or even liked slavery was the fact that there were slave revolts that persisted since the first slave ships were brought to the Americas all the way until the last country made it illegal. And that claim is not wrong. In fact, it is very right. Now, this is where the nuance of the claims lie. People can get confused between something being a choice versus something being enjoyed. When slaveholders and supporters of slaveholders of the past cheer Ye for saying that slavery was a choice, they are probably coming from the perspective that slavery was enjoyed by the so-called black people that were in bondage, mitigating any guilt on the part of the enslaver. However, the very argument that many opponents of Ye's comments make about African Americans resisting enslavement through slave revolts, in essence, could actually support the point of it being a choice. In 1791, when the Africans in Saint-Domingue rose up against the French, defeated the British and the Spanish to secure their freedom in what was known as the Haitian Revolution, was that not a choice that they made? In 1600, when the Africans imported into Brazil started escaping by the hundreds, established themselves an independent nation within a nation known as Quilombo del Palmares, which was home to tens of thousands of people throughout the 17th century, was that not a choice? In fact, when people of African descent rose up against their masters, escaped slavery, and fought wars to preserve their freedom throughout the Americas, including, but not limited to, the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina, the Black Seminoles and Maroons of Florida, the Maroons of Louisiana, the Cimarrones of Mexico, the Palenques of Colombia, the Maroons of Jamaica and other British Caribbean islands, did they not choose to liberate themselves when they did, and thus create communities whose descendants can still be found throughout the Americas today?
Yeah. You know, we never slaves.
No, never.
We don't get
Say it to the camera so they can hear you.
No, we were never slaves.
These were all choices that people made in order to secure their freedom. They did not wait for legislation. They did not wait for the white man to have a change of heart. They made a choice and took the initiative and abolished slavery on their own volition by carving out a space for themselves in spite of the white man's laws, and defended this territory, founding their own societies like great men and great women. In addition, there are even several cases that one can read about where the people who were documented as slaves on plantations were actually agents of the Maroons living in the outskirts of the colonial world. In Dominica, Martinique, and even Florida, there were plantation Africans that gathered intel, weapons, tools, salt, and other resources for the Maroons living in their territory in exchange for provisions that the Maroons independently grew. You see, in many cases, like in the case of Dominica, for example, in the early 1800s, colonial records documented that there were 20,000 enslaved Africans on the island. They also documented that there were roughly 800 Maroons who escaped slavery living in the mountains. Correspondences between colonial officials would later prove that, though many Africans were residing on plantations, they were working on behalf of the Maroons in the mountains. Just like the white man planted FBI agents to infiltrate black organizations, many blacks on plantations were agents infiltrating the colonial state and their slaveocracy for intel and weapons to bring back to the Maroons for their revolutionary wars against the establishment. That was also a choice. Now, but why or how would most people even know that history? Growing up in American public schools, you probably would not. We are taught a narrative that blacks were enslaved by whites and that they were so much more powerful than the blacks that there was nothing that could be done about it. Hence, stripping the active agency of the people of African descent in the historical narrative. Black people in this history become passive pawns to be maneuvered at the will of the white man. Hence, the black man has no choice. But when it comes time to learning about the founding of this country, we learn that George Washington and his white compatriots had a choice when it came to defeating Great Britain, the greatest empire this world has ever seen up to that point, and finding independence for white people. It's okay for whites in the historical narrative to have agency in their own history, but it is taboo for blacks. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Is that not a choice? Is it not a choice to be free or die trying? We may need to ask ourselves, what benefit do our enemies have by stripping us of our own agency in history, our own ability to choose? If you can be convinced that your fate was dependent on the decisions and choices of an enemy in yesteryear, then you can be convinced that your fate is dependent on the decisions and choices of the enemy today. You will look and wait for the enemy to change his ways and attitudes towards you, rather than you making a way for yourself regardless of who attempts to stand in your way. What Ye may have been trying to say is that at the end of the day, our existence is ultimately based on our choices. To me, once dissected, it's an empowering concept. Ye has explained himself in later interviews, and maybe we should accept his explanation instead of trying to silence or dismiss him as crazy. It's empowering because it calls into question the traditional victim-based historical narrative. We can take Ye's explanation for his comments and realize that maybe he was trying to take back ownership of his people's destiny. We can then dissect it and realize that it wasn't to minimize the horrors of slavery and the egregious actions of the white man to the black man in America. There were black people that made a choice to revolt. There were black people that made a choice to escape. There were black people that made a choice to create maroon communities. There were black people that made a choice to stay on plantations playing the part of a slave, but ultimately working as spies and agents for the revolutionary cause fomenting on the outskirts of the society. And on the other hand, there were those that made the choice to stay on plantations and, due to fear of the consequences of overt rebellion, resisted in their own clandestine manner through poisoning, sabotaging tools, and even outwitting the so-called master. Lastly, there were those that chose to snitch on the aforementioned for engaging in resistance to enslavement, and due to their fear of their so-called master. In the end, slavery was legally abolished all over the Americas in the 19th century because the enslaved people were rising up and taking up arms against their so-called masters, as was the case during the American Civil War when African Americans served as soldiers, spies, guides, pioneers, construction workers to assist the Union. Today, every day, we are all making choices as to whether we would stand up for what we perceive to be right versus staying silent and accepting a paycheck to sustain our perceived comfortable but dependent lifestyle. Freedom is not free. It takes courage. As long as we continue to think that we have no power to liberate ourselves and wait on the man to change his mind, we will be waiting a very long time for freedom.
Go for that. If you take up arms, you'll end it. But if you sit around and wait for the one who's in power to make up his mind that he should end it, you'll be waiting a long time. And in my opinion, the young generation of whites, blacks, browns, whatever else there is, you're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built, and the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods. And I, for one, will join in with anyone, don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable condition that exists on this earth. Thank you.